We have a very special conversation today. We have a very special guest. We have Jonathan Skrmetti, Tennessee Attorney General, here at the park. Thank you for coming. We're also joined by Alex Gladstein, Chief Strategy Officer of the Human Rights Foundation, and Zack Shapiro of Bitcoin Policy Institute. And we are going to be talking about code as protected speech, specifically liability for open source contributors in terms of the code they write and the vague regulatory environment that they tend to find themselves in right now, particularly because Bitcoin is money and this idea of open source software that the developer is not taking custody of funds, but they might be treated as a money transfer business. This is something that hasn't, it's like the edge of technology and legal dynamics. This type of conversation rarely really happens. It's starting to happen more and more, and it's been very promising on that front. I think America and Tennessee can be at the forefront of that, and I think it, can lead to, many great projects being built here in the state and also throughout the country. So it's probably more important than ever. I think a great place to start would be with you, Jonathan. I think for some of us, we're familiar with you and your work and your career. Is it possible for you to just give us a quick backstory on how you got here? How did you become Attorney General? Who are you?
Sure. Real quick. I'll talk fast and leave out a lot of details. So I grew up in Connecticut. My dad was an engineer. He did AI research like 30, 40 years ago. Am I on? Okay. So I grew up nerdy. We had an Apple IIe from when I was about 4 years old. I still really like video games, have for basically the entirety of my life. So I was a programmer a little bit when I was in college, did nuclear safety programming, if you can believe it. No accidents, so apparently I did a good enough job. But I ended up going to law school after majoring in philosophy. I thought I was going to be an intellectual property litigator, and then I got in and ended up being a prosecutor, which is far less lucrative. But I had a really neat career working for the Department of Justice, started in the Civil Rights Division. They kept sending me to Memphis, so I moved down to Memphis, did a bunch of work down there, met my wife. We got married, had kids. I could no longer afford to be a prosecutor, so I went into private practice for a while, doing some data privacy work, along with a lot of government investigation stuff, helping people who are dealing with the regulatory state. Got recruited by the last attorney general who was looking for a new chief deputy because he wanted someone with some familiarity with technology law. Actually taught cyber law as an adjunct at the University of Memphis purely for geek purposes. I thought it was really interesting. So he brought me in. We started looking at the social media companies, started looking at antitrust opportunities involving some of the really big tech companies. Then the governor scooped me up to be his counsel for a little while. And in Tennessee, we have a really weird system. The Supreme Court of Tennessee picks the Attorney General. So when the spot came open, I wasn't even going to apply. I was trying to talk other people into doing it. They didn't at the last minute. I was up till 3 a.m. finishing my application, got it in just under the wire, ended up getting the job. And it's an 8-year term, so I'm in till 2030. So that is my story in a nutshell.
Wonderful. We have Alex here. Alex has been building out the Human Rights Foundation since its beginning, and you do a lot of work globally with activists, particularly living under authoritarian regimes. When you think about this issue, what is your perspective on it? Where do your priorities lie? Why is it so important?
The overarching idea is it American for a blacksmith to make a knife and for the knife to be used in a crime and for the government to go after the blacksmith? That's just that's like the overarching idea. Is that an American thing to do? And obviously the answer is no. You go after the criminal, not the person who made the tool. So that's one conversation point or piece. The other one is that, look, the reality is most of the tools, at least, and this is starting to change, and we're trying to work on it, but most digital internet privacy tools so far have been created in freer societies, right? I mean, from what we understand, Bitcoin was probably created in a democracy, PGP. Most of the foundational internet privacy tools were mostly created in free societies because people have protections here. is the idea. I mean, that's one of the reasons why. If you look at like patent rates, like and creativity and entrepreneurship, with stronger rule of law and protections, you tend to see higher business creativity and higher entrepreneurship. North Korea, South Korea is an obvious example, but basically dictatorships, are pretty bad at creating a climate for people to express themselves freely. Whereas, our society is certainly not perfect, but we have a lot more room and people can be a lot more creative. And that has lent itself to a lot of advances in internet privacy, which is great. The problem is when that starts to stagnate or even backslide, and that's kind of what we're seeing right now. So I would say that we're interested in the just general idea of not going after people who make open source tools, but also cognizant of the fact that the people that we work with in authoritarian regimes rely on, in many cases, people in Western societies making these tools. And if you attack somebody making a tool in America, you're hurting the ability of everybody in the world to use that tool.
Wonderful. Now I'm going to go to Zack. Zack is very focused, working with Bitcoin Policy Institute, one of the preeminent policy organizations based in America, and proudly based out of Bitcoin Park. Zack, from your perspective on the American side, or your not necessarily clients, but like your the constituents that you represent are Americans. How do you focus on this? Like, where do your priorities lie? How do you think about this issue?
I would say two things. The first is raise your hand if you've heard of DigiCash or eGold or Liberty Reserve. A lot of people here. These were all attempts to create digitally native cash before Bitcoin. They all failed. They were all shut down. Why is it that Bitcoin worked when these things didn't? The answer to that question is that through proof of work, Bitcoin was able to solve the Byzantine generals problem and became the first digital currency that is operated truly on a peer-to-peer basis. There isn't a company that runs Bitcoin. There isn't a group of people that runs Bitcoin. Bitcoin is run by its users, for its users. And when you send a transaction, if you're validating that through your node, you are operating as a small node in a big network. And regulation thus far, thankfully, has recognized that Bitcoin is a peer-to-peer technology. We have guidance from the federal government saying that to the extent that you're operating on a decentralized network, that you're operating in a non-custodial way, we are going to recognize that basic fact that there isn't a company in the middle that could be regulated as a financial service business, to which the Bank Secrecy Act and the Patriot Act and the 2020 version of the Patriot Act apply. And that's been a cornerstone, at least in my work. I run a small law firm that represents Bitcoin startups. That's been critical for people who want to build useful tools for Bitcoin. There is this bifurcation between people who run a business model where you're custodying other people's funds and you're entrusted with that. And then there are a bunch of regulations that apply to you. And, I think in some ways that is totally fair. And then people who are just building a protocol, right, that is operated on a peer-to-peer basis. You are just creating software, just code that other people will use to send funds to themselves, perhaps for privacy-preserving reasons, or send to other people through the application. But like Alex said, it's just a neutral tool, and it is the actions of the people who use that tool that are subject to the laws. It's not the tool itself that gets punished. Recently, through two federal prosecutions of Tornado Cash, which is a privacy-preserving smart contract in the Ethereum network, and then Samurai Wallet, which is a privacy-preserving protocol for the Bitcoin network, the Department of Justice seems to have departed from the last 11 years of guidance we've had from FinCEN, the part of the Treasury Department that regulates these types of tools. And in each of these cases, the founders of these protocols who wrote the code and then operated some services around the code, which is, of course, distinct from running the code itself. The users run the code, not the people who wrote it. They are being charged with the crime of running an unlicensed money service business. Now, what does it mean to run an unlicensed money service business? Who do you get a license from? FinCEN. FinCEN has been unbelievably clear that non-custodial tools are not money transmission. They're not money service businesses. And we have federal prosecutors who I think are rightly concerned with, money laundering. Certainly in the Tornado Cash case, it looks like the North Korean government used that tool to launder a lot of money. But instead of sort of doing the difficult legwork to find the exit nodes to disrupt the operations of the North Korean agents, they're trying to go after the code itself. That started with OFAC, which is the part of the Treasury that sanctions entities that are primary money laundering concerns, sanctioning a piece of code, which is completely unprecedented, and then a criminal prosecution of the founders. And let me tell you, in the week after these cases dropped, the number of calls I got from founders, specifically in the Bitcoin community, that are building non-custodial tools that everyone was under the impression are just software, has had an incredible chilling effect. And we've done our best to say, listen, our best understanding of the law is the way it's been for 11 years. And, you should feel good building what you're building. Understandably, people have left the country, they've shut down their protocols, and there's just been this horrible chilling effect even before these cases have had the chance to work their way through the court. So that's why we care about this fight. It's both about the precedent that gets set in these cases, and it's about what that precedent, or even the perception of the precedent could be set, means for people that are building important technology on the Bitcoin network.
Awesome. With the understanding that the Attorney General hasn't been briefed at length about all of these issues, and considering that this is really, I'm treating it as a first touch point of something that we see often in the developer community, particularly when we're trying to encourage them to build in America and build in Tennessee. I'm curious on your first impressions and perspective here.
Sure. So the most important thing that the law can be is clear. Whether you agree with it or not, we have mechanisms that let people give feedback and change the law when they don't like it. We have processes that are tried and true for changing the law, but people need to know what the law is. And it's the uncertainty that really stifles innovation. Chilling effect is exactly the right terminology here. It is just fundamentally not American to go after people with the heaviest guns that the federal government has if they don't know to expect it. There are mens rea requirements for crime. There are situations where somebody might create a tool and they know what it's being used for, and they fall under the criminal conspiracy law. But they know that. They know that they're dealing with bad actors. They know that the tool is part of a larger project that is doing evil. And the government has to prove that beyond a reasonable doubt for them to be convicted. What you want to avoid is the Aaron Swartz model, where the government just starts hammering people to make a point and scare everybody away from trying anything around the edges of the law, because it's authoritarian and it reduces the opportunities for innovation and prosperity. So, I have a variety of disagreements with the current Department of Justice. And it sounds like this is another one, but at a time when there is so much overregulation in so many parts of the world, there's a huge opportunity for the United States to capitalize on that. Tennessee tries to be the most business-friendly state. I think we do a pretty good job most of the time, and obviously there are federal preemption issues. But if you compare us to, say, New York, the odds of us piling on when the feds don't are virtually non-existent, and we're not going to be getting creative at going after people unless they are clearly engaged in either a scam or something very deliberately designed to do something illegal. So I think the neutrality of technology is fundamental unless and until the government can meet its heavy burden of proving that there's something more going on. And I think we need to make sure that we have a very light hand with regulation. Let the problems develop. And again, there are people out there just straight up scamming, right? Everyone is well aware of that. The community to some extent polices itself, and there are well-established roles for the government to step in and clear that up. But all these areas where you have creative reading of the law, where you have hyper burdensome regulation being imposed, whether it's the SEC asserting its primacy or I know there are some facts being debated, but the Silk Road case, where there was a really strong government intervention, the government needs to make absolutely sure it has its ducks in a row, that it's moving clearly in ways that people can expect, that it's acting within the confines of the law. And if people in the government don't like the fact that the laws don't reach as far as they would like them to, the answer is not to try to bully courts into expanding the law. The answer is to go to Congress and say, we don't think this law is effective. Have public hearings, hear from all of the involved parties, hear from people who can explain the benefits of the technology, and make an informed decision. And then keep making the decision. If facts change, make the law better. But you don't have a small group of people deciding what the law should be and then inflicting pain on others because they're not complying with that.
Thank you. So we need to be very aware of the Attorney General's time. So we do have this is a very tight conversation. Alex, I mean, I think you have, out of all Bitcoiners I know, you have some of the most experience in terms of working in incredibly difficult regulatory environments. What do you think is the best way for this conversation to going forward? What are some like actionable steps?
Well,
How should we be thinking about
I
that?
just think it's great for you to be involved in this conversation because there's going to be parts of America that are going to be way more open to freedom technology than other parts of America, and that's one of the beautiful parts about America is that it's not just a monolith. But if Tennessee, can be a warm, welcoming place for people working on open source tools, free and open source tools, that's it. There's no, they're working on free and open source tools. Now they may have a business, and that's different, but the tool itself, the protocol itself, should be the government, and as you say, should be crystal clear about this. That'd be really great for Tennessee to do what it can to whatever it can do, issue statements, help people, create programs to welcome developers. I think that would be massive for the state, especially when we have a world where, look, obviously a lot of us are believers in this Bitcoin thing. Like we think it's going to happen, and it's happening. But let's say, put that to the side. There's there's clearly a non-trivial chance that Bitcoin becomes a large global currency. There's clearly at least a small chance. And if Tennessee's a leader in that area, man, I mean, this is setting the future generations of the state up big time. So, to whatever extent that, Bitcoin Park can help, I think would be great to steer the conversation there.
And I would just add that, HRF is an incredible supporter of the park. And a lot of what we do here wouldn't be possible without the Human Rights Foundation. I personally have had the privilege of working with Alex and the Human Rights Foundation team, his team over there for, I think, a little over 6 years now, training activists how to use Freedom Tech. And the work they're doing is incredibly impressive, and it really does change the world. It helps people's lives on the ground.
To give just one more example, and then let's
go
take
for
it with
it,
you.
Alex.
We host the Global Bitcoin Summit here at Bitcoin Park. We did it last year. We're going to do it again this year, and it brings Bitcoin leaders from more than 50 countries here to Tennessee, and we spend 3 days together learning from each other and getting enriched by the Tennessee community. So that's the kind of stuff that we're interested in, and Tennessee's just been a great home for that, and we hope to be able to continue with that.
Awesome.
Yeah, we hope you can come. It's
Yeah,
going to be in
I
October.
would love to. That sounds great. The acceleration of change in technology and culture is just hard to deal with right now. And there's a lot of conflict that's coming up as a result of that, and people trying to assert as much control as they can over the pieces of the world that they can control because they have a hard time just keeping up with all the change. But that, I think, is the wrong response. I think the fundamental values stay the same, but you cannot push for a static pocket in a dynamic world because you're going to get left behind. And I think the same innovation and prosperity and just a commitment to individual freedom that defined Tennessee for centuries, right? I mean, the people who came here were the people who couldn't tolerate living on the other side of the mountains. They wanted to get away. They wanted to live their own lives. Granted, there's a lot of stuff that happened in that history. Not all of it that we necessarily want to brag about, but there's a lot that we do want to brag about. There's a lot there that says somebody setting out on their own into the at least somewhat unknown to forge a life for themselves and their families can create great things. And you look around Nashville, and it is just booming because of that same underlying attitude. We want people to build things. We want people to invest in the future, not just in terms of money, but in terms of ideas, but always with a recognition that it's individual freedom that creates the best results. The government's never going to be able to dictate to people how to live their best lives. There are limits that the government sets. There are decisions that get made collectively through democratic processes, but there has to be, and there is, a lot of room for individual freedom. And so while my math skills are not great. That's why I went to law school. And I'm certain that I do not understand a lot of the nuances of what's happening. In terms of the big picture, I know that this is what we want here. We want to be a place where ideas can thrive, where people can be creative, where technology can move forward in ways that are going to benefit not just the people of Tennessee, but the people of the world. And so I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. And I do look forward to future conversations.
And let's just give you like an example of what we're talking about that's very specific. After the Samurai case started to unfold, people got very worried. We had the chilling effect. And for example, one very popular, very pioneering wallet for Bitcoin that's really useful. It was my favorite one to use. They're a European company, and they decided to withdraw from the U.S. Some people may say, oh, that was an overreaction. Well, that's their decision. They were worried about making business here, and that's absurd. I mean, we're basically on a short list in some of these cases with like North Korea and a couple other countries. It'd be like, oh, Bitcoin wallet, it is valid in all these places, except for the U.S. and Turkmenistan and North Korea. I mean, this is absurd. So, we're frustrated by that. We can no longer use that tool in our educational work in the United States. I mean, this is really silly. So that's one specific example. And as a reaction to that, Zack and his colleagues, came up with this fund, the P2P Rights Fund. And it's a way for people to donate. Let's go. Let's hear it for BPI. Seriously, this is, a lot of people were upset, of course, when the Samurai case unfolded, but basically nobody really did anything except for BPI, so they really deserve a lot of applause for that. And they've developed a fund where if you want, you can donate to the legal defense case, but you can also just donate to legal defense for open source developers generally. And the hope is that, devs will understand now that someone's got their back. So the P2P Rights Fund is also something that I think, you should definitely check out.
Yeah, I mean, please do if you have the means to donate to the P2P Rights Fund. Our goal is to get involved in any kind of case or regulatory action where this principle is at stake, where code is being regulated as if it were a company. And that will probably, unfortunately, have broad application in the future. And so developing a war chest for that is really important. Unfortunately, a lot of these issues really are at the federal level and preempt state policy. I did want to sort of be thoughtful about what conceivably could happen at the state level that would move the needle on this. And there were three things I could come up with. One is, and I'm sure this is a longer conversation, but these are things that I would hope you might consider as policy measures for the state of Tennessee to be as welcoming as possible to Bitcoin devs. The first is to be very clear, at least under Tennessee's money transmitter rules, that non-custodial tools that are not run by anyone, where the software does not have custody of anyone's funds and the funds are moving peer-to-peer, that is not money transmission in the state's interpretation of at least state law. The second is for companies to whom these regulations do apply. There's this really bad situation where, and sometimes you need to have a custodial element to your product. It's inevitable that you're going to have to register with FinCEN as a money service business, but then you have to go out and get 50 states worth of licenses. And that's, easily a couple $1,000,000 and then hundreds of thousands of dollars a year in maintenance costs. And, if Tennessee could be a leader in streamlining this process, whether that's just figuring out what is the lowest, compliance burden you could have, or even setting a model that other states could sign on to so that it's one application if you have to be a money transmitter and there's one set of rules and you don't need an army of lawyers to get this set up, that would be incredibly impactful. And then the third thing I think that could happen at a state level, it's a little bit different than the previous two, is tomorrow I'm speaking on a panel with Tor Eklund, who is the defense attorney in a case against a custodial mixer called Bitcoin Fog. And in that case, there's a little bit different regulatory issues. That product, I think, clearly does fall under money transmitter rules. However, there's a lot of concern about whether they got the right defendant in that case. And overwhelmingly, the evidence in that criminal case comes from this one firm, Chainalysis, you might have heard of, that does blockchain analytics, that tracks transactions. And they use a closed source methodology that they are unwilling to share with defense counsel. They're treating as a trade secret. Anyone who, even views it in camera needs to sign an NDA. And there are other firms out there that do this work using open source methodologies that can be audited and are provably fair. And we're not taking a private company's word on it. So to the extent there are criminal prosecutions or even civil cases in the state of Tennessee that rely on blockchain analytics for evidence, the government and the local prosecutors using open source methodologies and vendors that use open source methodologies rather than closed source companies like Chainalysis, I think could be incredibly helpful for due process for people who are creating these types of tools.
I would add two other quick things that we could potentially do as a state. The first is push back against federal regulation that deviates from the statutes. It's a huge priority for me. We've got 8 lawyers who do nothing but sue the federal government right now over regulatory matters. And I mean, it's like fundamental to our model of governance that like the anonymous bureaucrats can't make big policy decisions, and they've gotten way too comfortable doing that. And so with love, we push back and get them enjoined on a variety of issues. And the other thing is amicus briefs. So if there's ever an opportunity where we could talk about doing that, I'd be very interested.
Would love to, and we're definitely, the BPI is going to do amicus briefs in all of these cases, but would love to coordinate.
Before we wrap, sir, can I just ask you, do you own any Bitcoin yet?
So it was about 2011, and I was a frequent participant on the Fires of Heaven massively multiplayer online role-playing game boards. And these people started talking about Bitcoin, but there was also the SETI project where you could use your computer's downtime to help find alien life. And I was so much too altruistic. And so in complete and utter shame of having made the worst financial decision a human being could make in my lifetime, I've not been able to bring myself to buy Bitcoin since then. Perhaps you will inspire me to do it, but I'm still like, oh man, like that was so bad.
Let's get this man a BitX.
Yeah, let's make it happen. We'll make it happen.
You can build your own Bitcoin miner at home. Seriously, love it.
All open source.
All open source.
Wonderful. Can we get a huge round of applause for our attorney general? Fantastic. Thank you, guys. Thank you.